Welcome to today's lunch hour lecture. My name is Professor Bob Schill. I'm the director of the School of Architecture. I'm really looking forward to today's talk for all sorts of reasons. Introductions to these lectures are always very short, but particularly in respect to today's speaker, I couldn't begin to attempt to describe his career and trajectory in a short space of time. So I'm not even going to attempt that. Professor Steadman, I put it this way, over the last 25 years or so, he's been the most sought after PhD supervisor in our faculty. I think that might be one way of summarizing his importance to our community, and I'm really proud that he's here today to talk about his work to the university at large. Would you please welcome Professor Phil Steadman?
Thank you, Bob. Johannes Vermeer, the great Dutch painter, was born in 1632 and he died in 1675. And he probably lived all of his life in the town of Delft. This is his panoramic view of Delft. Vermeer's work was very much admired in his lifetime. His paintings sold for high prices. He became the head man of the Guild of St. Luke, the Guild of Painters in Delft, at the age of just 29. But after he died, he was rather soon forgotten. In the 18th century, his paintings tended to be attributed to other more prolific contemporaries, and he more or less disappeared as a historical personage. And he was brought back to life, so to speak. His reputation was resuscitated in the 1860s by a French art historian called Théophile Torre, who assembled a catalogue with photographs and who bought some of the pictures himself. And almost immediately, writers and critics started to compare Vermeer's work with the new art of photography, which had been commercialized just 20 years before by Daguerre. And I could give you many quotations. I'll just give you two. The first people to make this comparison, I think, were the Goncourt brothers in their journal in 1861. And they talked about Vermeer as the only master who has made a living daguerreotype of the red brick houses of his country. And they were talking about this picture, I think, the little street, as well as about the view of Delft. 100 years later, is that better? Okay, got to see Vermeer in the proper light. Yes, very good. Okay, thank you. 100 years later, Sir Kenneth Clarke, in his book on landscape, talked about the view of Delft, and he said that this was the closest that painting had ever come to a colored photograph. So what did these people mean? What were they talking about when they were making comparisons of Vermeer with photographs? I think that first, of course, they would be talking about the perfect illusion of space that Vermeer creates with his perspective geometry. There's the quotation from Clarke. As seen to best effect, probably in this picture, the music lesson, which belongs to the Queen, it's at Buckingham Palace. The illusion that Vermeer gives us of space and depth created through perspective geometry. The word photographic might also imply minute attention to detail, and we can certainly find that in Vermeer. The virginals, the instrument the woman is playing, has decorative patterns. They're printed on paper and pasted to the box, the case. And if we look at a small detail and enlarge it up, we can see that Vermeer renders this pattern, all the curlicues and little flowers, whatever they are, with minute attention. It's a very small part of the picture. But elsewhere, Vermeer paints quite freely, quite loosely, almost, one might say, out of focus. In this picture, the lace maker in the Louvre, look at these skeins of thread that spill from the woman's work basket. They're painted with dribbles of paint. It's almost like a Jackson Pollock. I think the most important characteristic of Vermeer's pictures that leads people to make comparisons with photography is his extreme truth to tonal values, his fidelity to the exact patterns of light and dark in a subject. Kenneth Clark might have compared the view of Delft to a coloured photograph, but if we remove the colour, it looks perhaps even more like a black and white photograph. Vermeer is often referred to as painting with light. Well, of course, you can't paint with light, you've got to paint with paint. But what it means, I think, is that he was a master of tone, a master of depicting the fall of light on objects, its interreflection, and the way it casts shadows. And it was perhaps all these comparisons with photography that began to suggest to people quite early as the end of the 19th century, that Vermeer might actually have used some kind of optical tool to help with painting. And specifically, they imagined that he used the camera obscura, the predecessor to the photographic camera. The camera obscura is a very simple device. You just have a lens, you project an image of some scene or subject onto a screen, perhaps onto a wall, and then you can study the image and perhaps trace it and work from it. 19th century, 18th century camera obscuras were quite small boxes, but in the 17th century, all the descriptions of cameras were of much larger setups, cubicles or booths or tents. This on the left is the earliest ever illustration of a camera obscura being used to look at a solar eclipse from the Dutch mathematician Gemma Frisius. Here on the right, the simplest form of this camera is just to have a screen on the wall opposite the lens. And the image you get is upside down, but if you turn it the right way up, it's also mirrored. So this is what would happen to Vermeer's monogram as you looked at it in the projected image. The first specific suggestion that Vermeer might have used optical apparatus of some kind was made in 1891 by the American graphic artist Joseph Pennell. And in the first half of the 20th century, a number of historians picked up the idea and they made experiments with camera obscuras, and they found features in Vermeer's paintings that seemed to reproduce artifacts of lenses, seemed to reproduce things that you would see in an optical image, but that you wouldn't see with the naked eye. The culmination of this developing argument came in a book published by Lawrence Gowing in 1952, just called Vermeer. I think that's really the best book on Vermeer. It's the most perceptive. Gowing was an artist as well as a critic, art historian. He was also the principal of the Slade School here in UCL, 1975-1985. And in his book, Gowing points to some very idiosyncratic characteristics of the way Vermeer paints. In particular, he says that Vermeer never uses line to describe the outlines of objects, as other painters might do. In fact, there are very few lines in Vermeer's painting at all, even in the underpainting. So look at the bridge of the bridge of the nose here in The Girl with the Pearl Earring. And you'll see that there's no line describing the bridge of the nose. Vermeer has noticed that the tone and hue of the bridge is exactly the same as the tone and hue of the cheek beyond, and he just paints across. And he knows that we'll understand the shape of the nose from the shadow on the right and underneath. What Gowing diagnoses, Gowing was absolutely convinced that Vermeer used the camera obscura, and in fact he thought that it was the formative influence on his mature style, he says. Gowing says what Vermeer seems to be doing is looking at patches of tone and hue and matching them in paint and almost forgetting what it is he's actually looking at. What do men call this wedge of light? A nose, a finger? What do we know of its shape? To Vermeer, none of this matters. The conceptual world of names and knowledge is forgotten. Nothing concerns him but what is visible, the tone, the wedge of light. Now, up to this point, as I said, the idea that Vermeer might have used a camera was been based on these properties of style and his painted treatment. And there was debate among art historians, Vermeer specialists, as to what was the extent and nature of Vermeer's use of optical instruments. Did he look at them? Was he occasionally inspired by them? Or did he actually work from them in some way, transcribing the images? I became interested in these questions in the 1990s, and I took a different approach. Anybody who looks at Vermeer's pictures of domestic interiors, like the music lesson, of which he painted more than 20, must be struck by the impression that many of them seem to share the same room. There are some different rooms, but look again at the music lesson. We always see a blank wall facing us. The ceiling has these rafters running across from left to right. The black and white tiles on the floor, and the windows, these lower lights, have a complex pattern of leading. And these occur in other paintings, all these features. So that at the top here is the ceiling in the music lesson, and the art of painting and the allegory of the faith, where it also appears, seems to be the same height of room, and the rafters run across, and they're about the same size and spacing. Here are the windows. This is the music lesson, and you can see that, perhaps, can you see that this pattern of leading is made of squares and circles and half circles, very characteristic. And we see it again in 7 other pictures. Sometimes Vermeer puts in a little stained glass insert, but basically it's the same pattern. And the black and white tiles, they also reappear, although sometimes in different patterns. I decided to try and determine what was the geometry of these rooms, and to see if the ones that look like the same room are, geometrically speaking, the same. And it's possible to do this by reconstructing the 3D geometry, by working the methods of perspective backwards, so to speak. I won't go into detail, but in making a perspective picture, you start from a 3D scene, and you convert it into a 2D image. I go in the other direction, go from the picture to the geometry of the scene, which you can do, it's fairly standard procedures. And these are my drawings of the music lesson, and at the top there's a plan view, and you can see the floor tiles and the viola da gamba and the virginals and the figures. And here it is in side view. These diagonal lines are the extent of what you can see in the picture. It's the angle of view. And they meet at the viewpoint, and this is, where's that? Anyway, the V on the left. This is the point at which Vermeer would have to put his eye to see the scene as it is depicted in the music lesson. And if he used a camera, it would be the point at which he put his lens. And you can perhaps imagine that these lines make a pyramid on its side, whose apex is at the viewpoint. In general, one thing one can't determine in all this process is the absolute size. One can get relative sizes, but so far as the geometry is concerned, these might just as well be dolls in dolls' houses as real people in real interiors, except for the fact that Vermeer shows a lot of real objects which survive, or examples of which survive. So if we take the music lesson, the virginals is recognizable as the work of the Antwerp firm of Ruckers. Here's one in a museum. The stands are different, but the instrument itself, the case, is, I think you can see, the same. It has a pattern, these printed papers with double seahorses. I don't know whether you can make them out, but they're the ones that Vermeer shows, and these other patterns. This is Vermeer's rendering of the pattern on the lid, which I showed you before, and above is a surviving actual printed paper of the kind that was used in the 17th century. So I think you can see how very accurately this is reproduced. Every curlicue. The chair. This is the same, this is a chair you can't see here really, but it's got little lions' heads in brass on the back. Here it is in another picture, the glass of wine, and now you can see the lions' heads. There are several of these chairs in the Rijksmuseum and in Delft, and this is in Delft, and you can perhaps see how the turning of these members and the profiles of the horizontals are exactly the same. These are real objects. And the viola da gamba, well, it's a viola da gamba. They're made in standards. It's made in a standard size to fit between people's legs. So it's possible to compare all these rooms that seem to show the same room, as it were. And I went through a process. I used the floor tiles as a kind of measuring stick, as it were, a scale. And if you make this smaller or larger, you can make the whole room bigger and smaller. And you can look at the effects on these real objects and see when they come to their known sizes, assuming that Vermeer reproduced them, of course, depicted them at their real sizes. And you can compare the dimensions of the room. And it turns out that perhaps as many as 11 pictures do show what is, geometrically speaking, few anomalies, but it is basically the same room. It's a room that Vermeer used as his studio. I won't go into detail, but, well, okay, I'll leave that. And the furniture and props are repeated because he's making tableaus. He's rearranging them in the same room for his various compositions. In the music lesson, on the back wall, there's a mirror, which reflects some of the floor tiles, and it reflects the woman's head and the table with its carpet, and if we enlarge it, you can see that. There's a group of pieces of furniture, slightly mysterious, but if you look carefully, you can see that one of them is an easel with a canvas on it, and behind there's a stool, and up in this top left corner, there's what must be a very small part of the back wall of the room behind us, behind Vermeer, as he was painting. And you can work out geometrically the angle at which the mirror hangs, and that makes it possible to reconstruct the part of the room that is reflected just in the mirror. This part down here, my pointer is not working. Okay, and here's the tile pattern matches across. Here's the easel, here's the stool. The viewpoint of the picture is indeed at the eye point of somebody sitting on the stool, and here's the back wall. And the important point about this is that we now have a measurement for the whole length of the room, from front to back. This happens to be the same, well, yes, it is the same dimension as the room in which Vermeer was known to have painted in his mother-in-law's house on the Oude Langendijk. So we've now reached the central discovery of my book, Vermeers Camera, published in 2001. And it's this. Here's a plan of the room. So that the blank wall that we're looking at frontally is on the right here. From the mirror reflection, we've got the back wall on the left. The window wall is at the top. And these diagonal lines show these angles of view, these pyramids on their side. And these are the viewpoints of 6 pictures. And if you carry back these diagonal lines, they describe a width on the back wall. We can do the same thing in side view. So you can perhaps imagine that by this geometrical process, we can arrive at a rectangle in each case on the back wall. And in those 6 cases, and possibly more, the rectangle is the exact size of Vermeer's canvas. And I think it's very difficult to explain that strange geometrical coincidence. Nobody has produced any explanations, other than that Vermeer had a booth camera. We're now looking towards the back of the room. He had a booth there. This is the blank wall. There's the window wall. He puts his lens to the different positions of the viewpoint. He must be able to move the lens around. He's projecting onto the back wall. It's upside down. It's left to right. And the reason that this projected image is the same size as the canvas is because Vermeer has traced it, has worked from it, or has transcribed it in some way. My demonstration depended, as I've explained, on the perspective geometry, reconstructing the perspectives. I had another way of testing the same results. We made a model of the room at 1/6 scale with little furniture and dolls. And instead of Vermeer's camera Obscura, we've got a plate camera at the back whose lens you can put into the positions of the lens, of the viewpoints of the Vermeer's pictures. And the plate of the camera, the screen where you put the plate, is in the line of the back wall. And so we can make photographic simulations of the pictures. And this is the music lesson Of course, there are differences, but one thing we were quite pleased with was the way that some of the shadows come out, the shadows of the legs, the virginal, and the windows, and so on. Here's another example, without the figures in this case, of the concert. And this is a picture which has another painted painting called the Procuress by Van Baburen, still exists, and I've used a little photograph to simulate it there. So that, in brief, is the main message of Vermeer's Camera. And for me, and some of those who read the book, I think this is an absolute knockdown, clear-cut demonstration of the fact that Vermeer did indeed use a camera, and that it was a booth camera that he worked inside. And that he at least traced large parts or transcribed large parts of the images of his paintings from optical images. And the fact that it's a geometrical argument, not based on documents, but based on objective geometrical properties of the pictures as they exist today, I think gives the argument a special force. But I didn't convince everybody. And in particular, some distinguished Vermeer specialists made some counter-arguments. And I just want to say a couple of words about those. One of the arguments that was made is that Vermeer's pictures of interiors are not snapshots of daily life in the Vermeer household. I paraphrase. These are very carefully considered compositions in which the interrelationships of two-dimensional shapes in the 2D image is as important as this illusion of space that we get from the perspective. And my answer is, of course, they're not. No, they are indeed very carefully considered. The critics are imagining that perhaps making a picture with a camera obscura is like taking a snapshot. Of course, it's not. Indeed, one can use the camera obscura precisely as a kind of composition machine, because what it does is turns a scene immediately into a picture. So Vermeer could have provisionally set out his furniture and his props, got his models into place, and then looked at the resulting image in the camera, and then said to his assistant, move the picture over, get the girl to turn a bit, raise her arm, whatever, until he was satisfied. So the camera is a composition machine. In fact, that Vermeer could have worked like a 19th century studio photographer. The second criticism is more dismissive, and it says bluntly, it is a basic mistake to even imagine that what we see in Vermeer's pictures are real scenes. These are imaginative constructions from Vermeer's creative, fertile mind. And this view is one that's been advanced with some force by Walter Liedtke, who tragically was killed in a train crash a month ago, but he was the man who knew more about Vermeer than anyone else. This was a view that he put on a number of occasions, but there's a strange paradox here, because Liedtke and other Vermeer scholars have been very happy to recognize all these real objects that appear in the pictures and to show where they came from. I mentioned some examples in the music lesson, and here this painting in the concert, but there are many more. This is the table in the concert, and it's got a carpet over it, but you can perhaps just see, this is a real table. There are several of these in museums in Holland, and they have the same round knee, so to speak, and this square ankle. It's the same table, basically. This is the allegory of the faith, and behind the figure personifying faith is this large crucifixion, which is recognizable as a work by Jacob Jordaens. Vermeer has copied it fairly accurately. There are some differences. And there's reasons to believe that this was a painting that was actually in his stepmother's house. It appears in the inventory of possessions. This is maps. Vermeer was a man with a mania for maps. There are at least 6 that appear sometimes more than once in his pictures. This is the soldier and laughing girl. The painting on the left, the map on the right. It's reproduced with extraordinary precision. Oh, sorry, whoops. Come on. You see that the little cartouches, the figures, the ships in the sea, all the details, even down to these printed paper commentaries that are stuck below. These are printed on paper and stuck on canvas. This is the astronomer. He's got a book open. And it has a diagram, you can't see it here, but it has a diagram on it, which allows you to identify not just what book it is and what page, but what edition. And this is a celestial globe showing the constellations, and here is the real globe by Hondius, and it's positioned exactly in the position that Vermeer has got it. So it's surely perverse to argue, as Leaker and others have, that these are all conjured from Vermeer's imagination. It's a real room, they're real objects. Vermeer was a great genius, but he depicted reality. Now, soon after Vermeer's Camera, my book, was published, an American engineer called Tim Jenison was given a copy of my book by his daughter for Christmas. Tim Jenison is a computer specialist, and he developed the first computer systems for video editing and built a big company called NewTek, which also does computer special effects for movies. So he's a man who knows about optics and about realistic images. And I'd left two questions open at the end of my book. One was this question that in the simple kind of form of booth camera that I've described to you, the image is upside down, which is okay, but it's mirrored. And it's clear from the pictures, the paintings themselves are not mirror images, that the globe is the correct way round. So how did Vermeer reverse the image again, get it, unmirror it, so to speak? That's not so difficult. The second question is more tricky. If you're inside a booth, you're in the semi-darkness. How could you see to paint, and particularly how could you see to paint in colour, if they're painted in colour? You're in the low light. How could you see what was on your palette and what was on your canvas? I left those questions open. I had some ideas. Jenison thought hard about the questions, and he was having a bath one evening in his hotel in Amsterdam, and he had a revelation, a sort of Archimedes moment. And he conceived of a device, a very simple optical device, I'll show you in a moment, which he thought would solve both these problems at once. And he tried out the method to reproduce some photographs, and it seemed to work. He made other experiments, but he convinced himself that in order to really prove his argument, he would try to paint a Vermeer, as he said, even though he'd never picked up a paintbrush in his life. And he set about, he hired a warehouse in San Antonio in Texas, where he lives, and he set about building Vermeer's studio at full size and furnishing it as for the music lesson. And he built a big cubicle camera, Obscura, at the back. I'll show you it in a moment. Jenison is a friend of Penn Jillette, who is one half of the stage magician act Penn and Teller, appearing nightly at Las Vegas. And Jenison was telling Penn about this Vermeer obsession, and Penn said, hold on a moment, we're going to make a film of this. And to cut a long story short, Penn and Teller made a film over a period of 4 years of the construction of this room and the painting of the picture, and the result was released in cinemas last year. The film is called Tim's Vermeer, and it was shortlisted for an Oscar and nominated for a BAFTA, but we didn't get either of them. But it's on video now. I'm not going to show you clips, but I'll show you some stills. Now here is Jenison's device. It's very simple. It's a mirror on a stick. It's a metal mirror, so it's got one reflective surface. And what you do, they told me not to do this, but I'm going to do it. What you do, okay, you've got the mirror here, little 45-degree metal mirror. And suppose you've got a lens here casting an image onto a screen here, okay? So you put your canvas flat next to the optical image. So here's the image of the scene. We're painting a scene that's over there. We look down, and in the mirror, we can see part of the optical image. And if we look past the edge of the mirror, we can see the canvas. Now we apply paint, and we find experimentally a color and a tone that matches what we see in the mirror. And if they've got a really good match, you can't see the edge of the mirror. And that's it. That's how it works. You work across the whole canvas. So you want to pass it around. Now this solves my two problems that I was referring to. First of all, the reversal of the image. It's a mirror, so it mirrors it back again. The second problem was working in low light, and it solves that problem because everything is in low light. You've got one source of illumination, windows in the studio. They're illuminating the canvas, low light. You've got the optical image. It's being produced in low light. But everything tracks together. If a cloud goes over the sun, all the lighting goes down. The canvas is less well lit. The optical image is not so bright. But once you've got a match, it's a match that works in low light and works when you come out of the cubicle. Jenison invited me and my wife early on to go to San Antonio to look at, this is me, I'll jump over that. This is the producers and cast, essentially, of Tim's Vermeer. This is Tim Jenison. This is Teller, who directed the film. This is Penn. This is David Hockney, who's also in the film. There's me. We had, Jenison and I, when I went to Texas, we decided to paint a Delftware vase together with his device. We both painted. It didn't really matter. Neither of us were very good painters, so it didn't matter who was wielding the paintbrush. And this is the result, for what it's worth. It seemed to work. We were encouraged. Jenison then spent about 7 months building and furnishing the set as for the music lesson. Here he is. He's bought a 17th century Ushak carpet, had a Delftware vase made in Delft. There's the virginals, the dummies standing in for the figures at this point. Here he is. He's decided to grind lenses himself and to grind his own paints. Here he is making a chair leg, attaching the printed paper decoration to the virginals. This is his daughter Claire, who stood in for the girl. She had to stand still, so she had her head clamped. And this is the studio as a whole. Now we're looking backwards here. The wall, the front wall that we see in the pictures to our right, this is the virginals from the top. Here's Claire, the windows. And this is Jenison now at work over here with his optical apparatus. And you may wonder why he hasn't got a booth. And the reason is that fairly soon he struck serious problems. It was possible to see with a simple booth camera, the kind I've described to you, a lot of detail, get a very nice picture. But when he started to work on things like the painted paper decorations, he found it wasn't sharp enough or bright enough to work from. So he was cast down. In the film, he says it seemed like a deal killer. But he thought about this, and he came up with a solution, which was in place of the white screen that he was projecting onto previously, he put a plain mirror, another mirror, a flat mirror. And that increased the brightness of the image that he was working from. He doesn't have to see it all at once, of course. Increased the brightness by an order of magnitude. In fact, in this setup, he substituted a concave mirror, which has the same effect. So this is his sketch of his final arrangement, which he used to paint with. It's easier to see it down here, I think. The flat canvas, the lens of the camera obscura, as it were, casting the image, the 45-degree mirror, and then at the back, instead of the screen, he's got this concave mirror, or he could have had a flat mirror. And he found that actually the image was now so bright that he could take away the walls of the camera. He could work in the open, which is what was happening in that slide that you saw now. Okay. Now this is the final painting. Vermeer on the left, Jenison on the right. Let's remind ourselves what we're looking at here. On the left is a painted canvas produced in the 17th century. On the right, this is the transcription in paint of the optical image created of a scene set up in a warehouse in Texas. It's not the same, even geometrically, as Vermeer's. There are Obviously, the two figures are different. There are slight differences in the geometry. This painting is much brighter here. There's a different distance from the wall of the virginals. If you were able to see the paintings in close-up, you would detect, I think, a certain mechanical quality to Jenison's painting, a certain painting by numbers feel. But of course, nobody's pretending that Jenison is a great artist, at least of all him. This is an experiment. The point is to test a technical hypothesis. Does the method work? And for my view, I don't know what you think, is that it is a triumphant yes. It is possible with a very simple optical device that could have been made in the 17th century to produce Vermeer-like, in the broadest sense, results, produce these kinds of optical qualities that we recognize in Vermeer. Have we got time? I was just going to do... I think one of the most successful passages in Jenison's painting, technical point of view, is the carpet. So I'm just going to... we're just going to have a straw poll, very unscientific, going to ask you to identify. Here's Vermeer's carpet and Jenison's carpet. So I'm going to ask you, those of you who think the top image is Vermeer's, can I put up your hands? Okay, yes, okay, 10 people. And those of you who think that the bottom image is Vermeer's. Well, the majority has it, you're right. Some of you might have perhaps spotted the cracks in the paintwork here and so on, or you might have very good memories of the real painting, shown it enough times. But anyway, some of you put up your hands. Obviously, that doesn't prove anything. We're just looking at projected images. But the big question, of course, that remains is, did Vermeer work this way? Did he invent something like Jenison's mirror instrument, turn himself into a transcription machine? I'm not sure that I've entirely made up my mind on these issues. I go back and forward. Jenison and I have looked very hard in the 17th century literature to try to find descriptions of something like this. We've looked in the literature of painting technique, such as it is. We've looked at books on optics and natural magic and perspective. We found some suggestive hints, but nothing definitive. For me, the most powerful evidence is not greatly emphasized in the film, has to do with tonality. It's the subject with which we started. Look again one last time at the music lesson and look at the far wall up at the top. And I think you'll see it as a wall that is painted in this yellowish tone of distemper or whatever it is. And it's perhaps a bit brighter at the left than it is at the right because it's illuminated from the left. Is that okay? Here's a detail, and this is from a high scan image from Buckingham Palace. So this is this piece of wall. And if you take a small part, using the Photoshop program, you take a small part from the right-hand side and move it to the left, and we take a small part at the left and move it to the right. This is the result. Do you believe that? I don't believe it, and I've seen it many times, but it's true. And the reason we don't see it is that our minds are hardwired not to see this. Not even Vermeer could have seen it. You just cannot see a shadow gradient in tone like that. We can see, when we see two tones against each other, we can see relative tone, we can compare them. But our minds and brain, our eyes are not light meters. So here is something that Vermeer has reproduced that he could not have seen, but he could have done it with some sort of device that allowed you to reproduce tones precisely. And here's another last example. This is from Jenison's picture. This is at the point where he's painted the black and white floor tiles, and you can perhaps see that some of these at the left are in shadow, but we see them as black and white. Now let's step back in time and look at the picture when he's just painted the white tiles. And you'll see that those white tiles you were just looking at are dark grey because we're not looking at them against the black. In fact, the darkest white tile is darker than the lightest black tile. Tim Jenison reproduces his effect, okay, as does Vermeer. I believe there can be now little doubt that Vermeer used some kind of optical instrument that allowed him to match tonal values in paint exactly, but what this might mean for Vermeer studies, for the wider history of art, indeed the wider history of photography, would be another whole lecture. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Phil. That was a really fantastic talk. It was such a full lecture. We've run out of time for questions on camera. So I suggest if anyone has a question to grab Phil as we wrap up. So no time to take questions from the audience on camera, but we'll finish now, and then if anyone wants to ask Phil a question, come forward. Thank you.